Trinity Sunday all the way to the last Sunday of Trinity, or the last Sunday of Pentecost, right before Advent, we have lessons that are so full of information and are so well known in many ways that it would be very easy to spend just an entire day looking and examining even just one part of these particular lessons. All the lessons for today, as you probably noticed, are framed, and this is not my doing, except for the reading, the Japanese reading, are framed in the concept of food preparation, or has something to do with how food is gathered or put on the table or whatever. The first lesson being the story about Abraham and Sarah. I think that's the first time I've heard people laugh, John, when reading that particular passage. But it's appropriate because Sarah laughs, and she has a son whose name is what? Isaac, which means laughter. And so it's only appropriate, I think, that people would laugh. It is a funny story in many ways. Huh? That's, yes. So, it was a good spin, and actually it's a very entertaining story. It's a very dire story, actually, when you realize what's going on, because those, God and those angels are on their way somewhere. Where are they on their way to? No, they're not on the way to the mountaintop, no. They're on the way to Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So this is, this is a little stop along the way. And Andy and I know this story extremely well. We can tell you the ins and outs of it because it is the first chapter of the cookbook that we wrote. It's the first meal that we cook in the cookbook. The only way that this particular meal could have ever actually been fashioned so quickly, because you notice the people arrive, and Abraham says to Sarah, go and prepare something. He says, I'm going to go kill the fatted calf. Now, if you go and kill a calf, the only way it can be ready soon is if you do what? No, you have to do more than that. Preheat it? No. Pre-cook it? No. No one help. You have to cut it up and serve it how? Shish kebab style. In fact, that's the word shish kebab is a Middle Eastern word. It comes from that particular way of cooking something very, very, very quickly. That's the only way you could have gotten it ready. And the way they made bread in those days was really interesting also. They would take mud, they'd create mud, and you would put the unleavened bread down onto the mud, and then you would put the coals on top of it. That's why when you see Middle Eastern bread, it's very, very dark on one side, the other side is quite light. And the mud got actually hot and actually cooked the bread from the coals and everything that are put on top of the bread. These are some of the things that we learned when we were writing the cookbook, and particularly about this particular story. The Japanese story that I included for today, I can remember, she says in this particular story that from then on, God is what she called that particular type of cooking. When I was taking Japanese lessons and I was in Japan, there was a very similar dish, which you take like that, the piece of meat, and you just push it through the water, 1, 2, 3, and it's done. It's boiling hot water. And they call it and they call it shop. That's what it's called, to make it have a little bit of that particular dish, shop. Because you just 1 chop, 2 chops of the water, and it's done. That's all it gets cooked. And it's wonderful, it has wonderful taste. And so that was sort of the same thing for this morning. She, as you say, one of the reasons I chose it was because she's talking about the memories of her father and how it was that her father cooked. In my family, my father was the cook. My mother was an only child, and she never learned to cook because her mother did everything for her. So by the time she cooked, she went to get married, she just had no idea. My father did all the cooking. He worked all day, and she worked all day too, and then came home until she was pregnant. And then she learned from my father a little bit more how to cook. But she was so afraid when she got pregnant because she had knew nothing about a baby, but luckily they lived next door to my father's sister. My father's sister came over and told her how to take care of the baby and everything. But my mother was not a cook, and she would never claim to be. In fact, one time, the stove caught on fire at home, and instead of calling the fire department, she called my father. And he said, well, for God's sake, call the fire department. And she hung up on him, and he came home, and the whole stove was melted and everything. He said, did you call the fire department? She said, no. He said, why not? He says, because you yelled at me. So, interestingly enough, the next day, my mother gets a phone call. Hello, this is Essie? Yes. This is Dialing for Dollars. There used to be a TV show called Dialing for Dollars. If you can guess what today's lucky number is, you're going to win a prize and some money. And it was between 1 and 10. And she said, oh, I'm not watching, I'm not listening today. He says, well, just take a guess. She said, okay, 6. He says, that's right! She won $850 and a new stove. My father swore she had it planned all the time. You could say, or some people might say, that it was, as my father said, it was sort of planned. This whole idea of planning or what's going to happen with people's lives is one of the questions that comes up in the final lesson for today, and that's the whole idea of the call of the disciples. Now you see, if you look at that list of the disciples, who's missing on that list? Does everybody see somebody who's missing on the list? There's 12 that are called, so if you count, there are 12 there. But there's one that's missing that's really the standout. Now, you see, Luke never knew Jesus. Even though he wrote about him, as far as we know, he never knew him. Luke was an apostle. And there's a difference between a disciple and an apostle, at least in my way of thinking. A disciple is one of the people who followed Jesus during his lifetime. An apostle is one that's sent out after Jesus dies. Now, the church often doesn't make a distinction, especially the Roman Catholic Church doesn't make a distinction. Particularly, they call apostles and disciples interchangeably, but I believe that there is a difference. And that's why you have two different words. Otherwise, they would all be called one thing. So Luke and Mark, who was the other gospel writer, never saw Jesus either, as far as we know. Who's missing there? No? Jude. Jude's not in there. St. Jude, patron saint of lost causes. He's replaced in this list by whom? Thaddeus. Yeah, and Thaddeus also known in some places as Bartholomew. So if you have St. Bartholomew and St. Thaddeus, you don't see too many churches called St. Thaddeus, do you? But St. Bartholomew, yes. And it depends on which list you use. Each gospel writer had their own list of disciples. So if you think it's hard to remember who the disciples are, part of the reason is because they're a different list, depending on which gospel reader you read. Now, if you have to go to the catechism in any of the churches in the Roman Catholic Church or the Episcopal Church or the Lutheran Church or whatever church you might have grown up in, you have to learn the names of the disciples, but you may have learned different names. And who these people are is really very confusing too. Tradition has it that Thomas was Jesus' brother, the twin. That's what Thomas means. And Simon and Jude were also his brothers. Tradition has it. Joseph, through maybe his first marriage. And then there's this person by the name of James. There's two James listed here. James the Greater, who is John's brother, and James the Less, the son of Alphaeus. It's listed in the list here. There's also, in tradition, there's this other James, James, the brother of our Lord, who is the first bishop of Jerusalem. And how does he fit into it? Well, if you grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, they would say that James, the brother of our Lord, and James, the son of Alphaeus, were the same person. He wasn't the same Alphaeus, or Alphaeus was just a wrong name or whatever. Depends on how you look at it. As far as the Roman Catholic Church is concerned, Jesus, of course, had no brothers and sisters. So all the ones that are listed in Scripture are sort of excised from the list. And depending on where you grew up again and how you grew up, you might have different lists about who was actually called. So If you're confused as to who the disciples and the apostles are, I just want to let you know there was a good justification for it. Yes?
In the famous painting, The Last Supper, is St. Judas.
Is Judas there or St. Jude?
St. Jude.
St. Jude, and then there's also Judas. They're both in the painting.
Both.
Right.
So isn't that the original group, or does anybody else think they're their own?
I'm not sure that Da Vinci knew them.
Now, is James in the painting?
Yes.
The younger James.
Both are.
Claims sitting on the right hand of Jesus that maybe was a woman, according to the Da Vinci Code also.
Yeah, that's John. You're thinking of
John?
Yes. Yeah, John is very young and feminine looking, perhaps, and he's the only one that doesn't have a beard. And the thought was that he was so young that he hadn't grown one yet, and also he was probably unmarried, and that was also part of the whole thing, as to whether Jesus had a beard or not. Who knows? We don't know what any of these people really look like. And so all the depictions are just guesses. But we do know through various parts of the Bible that Jesus addresses his brothers and sisters at certain points. And at another point says, who are my brothers and sisters? And who is my mother? And so forth. I actually remember Bella Absent. Remember Bella Absent? I see Fran here today with her hat on. Reminds me of Bella. The only lady with a hat on today. Does anyone still wear a hat? That's Stephen's son.
Yes.
Oh, no, Nina has a hat on too. I'm sorry, yes, okay. Well, I should have guessed that, so I don't think I've ever seen Nina without a hat. So, all right, so you have Bella Absent. She used to wear the big hat, and Jessie Helms, her favorite friend, from North Carolina, and said, women should not be in politics. After all, there are no women at the Last Supper. She backed him up against the wall, and she held him by his tie and said, yeah, but they're going to be some at the next one. If you knew Bella.
They said that Mary was somewhere there.
Huh?
They said that Mary Magdalene was somewhere there.
Yeah, Mary Magdalene was probably there. Unfortunately, probably serving. Who knows? Mary and Martha might have been there. Somebody had to serve the dinner. If you remember Father Guido Sarducci's version of it, there certainly had to be somebody serving the meal there. So just one picture. Remember Father Guido Sarducci? Yes. He had this great thing about buying the. He went to an auction, a celebrity auction, and you remember Father Guido Sarducci from Saturday Night Live? Yeah, they realized heavy Italian thing. He said, I went to the charity auction the other night, and I went and did something because there's a nice at church. And so the only thing they had up that I was really interested in was the menu from the Last Approach. Now I've been a priest all this time, and I know a lot about the Last Supper, but I never knew there was a Last Approach. And he goes on and on about what the menu was for the last brunch. But he talks about who had to have been there serving, and how they couldn't get too much because they were getting ready for the big meal, the big supper, the Last Supper, They didn't have anything from the Last Supper; it had already all been bought out, But I got the menu from the Last Brunch, and he holds it up, this big scroll upstairs with the meal and everything. So anyway, I digress. The whole idea of calling these disciples and sending them out. Once they're sent out, then in effect they are apostles because they've been sent out. This may be why the church also calls them apostles, because they are sent out. They get a commission as such to go out and to heal and change the world and so forth. It brings up the whole issue for today of what I think this is one of the central foci of all the lessons, and that is the whole idea of interaction with God and what that's called. And some people call that a calling. People are called. And so one of the questions I have for you this morning is, do you, based upon your reading, your understanding, your own personal experiences, do you think that people are actually called to certain types of work, certain types of professions, to certain types of lifestyles?
Yeah.
And if so, if you do believe that's true, then how do you know what your calling is?
Because
It comes naturally.
it feels right.
It feels right?
That's right.
Well, some things feel right sometimes, but they don't feel right next week. You know, and how do you know?
But it's something you don't have to question at. It becomes internal. There's no questioning. Someone else would talk to you about it and you affirm it. And you understand that that's what it is.
Yeah, that's part of the one thing that's really essential, I think, at least to the Christian understanding of calling, is that it's not enough just to feel it. Somebody has to confirm it in you. In the church, how are men, you might not open this up to it, it's very dangerous, but in the Episcopal Church, how are people called? How do people get to be priests? What do they have to do? What do you do? Let's say you really feel that you want to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. What process do you go through? What do you have to do?
Isn't that what's called discernment?
Discernment. What is the discernment process in the Episcopal Church? Let's say tomorrow, let's say I said to you, Kathy Green, I think you would make a really good priest. I really think you should go through the ministry's process. And you say to me, well, that's nice of you, but what does that mean? What does it mean? How do we choose priests in this church?
Well, to discern something is to, I guess, spend a lot of time thinking about it and talking to people. And even if you say, I'd like to be a doctor, then you have to discern whether you want to be a doctor. Go visit the hospital, see what's involved, research it, and then decide for yourself if it's still something you want to do.
All right, okay, so how does that happen in this church? How do people get to be priests?
You have to apply, and you have to have people backing you up saying, talking about it, kind of like a recommendation.
That's an invitation? Well, actually, the way it happens in this church is that if you woke up one day and said, this is really what I want to do, you'd have to, first of all, go to the vestry, the board of the church, and say, this is what I'd like to do. Will you sponsor me? And so the vestry representing all of you has to say, okay, we will sponsor you through the discernment process. And at that point, you go through some process, whatever the church has set up. Some churches have set up an elaborate process. Some churches, for instance, you have to do some sort of work for the church for 2 or 3 years before you can even go any further. Some Episcopal churches. Some churches, they just say, okay, I'll write a letter to the bishop. In the old days, just before I was ordained, all you had to do was get up and say, Rosemary, get up and say, I want to be a preacher. Went to the bishop. The bishop said, are you sure? He said, yeah, and that was it. But not anymore. It's a whole discernment process, as Kathy pointed out. And the parish makes a discernment, and then the vestry has to vote on it, and then they have to write a letter to the bishop saying, I think that this person should be recommended to the Ministries Commission. There's a Ministries Commission in the diocese. And at that point, the Ministries Commission looks at all your paperwork, all the things you put together and work together, and you have to write your own history of your personal journey, your personal spiritual journey to this moment. And then after that, you go away to a ministry's weekend, maybe, if the people at the diocese think that you speak the right language and say the right things. You go away to a weekend, and then you have a whole group of people, maybe as many as 30 or 40, who are interviewing you for the whole weekend. And then they make a recommendation to the bishop. But before the bishop even sees you, you have to go have a psychological evaluation. You have to go have a medical exam. And as I told you before, if you don't pass either one of those, then you're automatically out. And it used to be, and to some extent it's still true, if you weren't physically fit, you couldn't be ordained. And also if you were not physically perfect, you couldn't be ordained. What I mean physically perfect is you couldn't have 6 toes, you couldn't have web feet, you couldn't have a finger missing, you couldn't be blind, you couldn't be deaf, you couldn't be any of those things. And that's still the case in the Roman Catholic Church. You can't be a woman either because there's no male genitalia parts on the forms. Female genitalia parts on the forms in order to be for the medical forms, and so you're considered to be deficient. Peg says, I won't even go there. Yes, it's true. This is nothing you said. It's good to know it's nothing you said, right? You know, it's just that you don't have the right body parts. That's how they keep people out. And then, after all that, you have to go through a psychological, and there's any sort of inkling that you may not possibly, or if you're not using the right words, or if you don't articulate clearly what your discernment is, or your calling, or if you say, the psychiatrist says to you, so what makes you think you're called to be a priest? And you say, I've heard voices from heaven. They went, so even if you have heard voices, you can't say that in order to get through. And then after all that, then you go to the bishop, and the bishop still has a choice after all that to decide that you're not worthy to be ordained. And at that point, he or she sends you to seminary, and you have to go through seminary, and you have to learn everything, and you have to pass all your exams and all that. And even after all that, if you have not passed your exams and have not learned anything, then you still cannot be ordained. And it can happen at any point along the way. And it's not a short process, it's about a 7-year process.
Well, I just want to think back in the 60s. If you were a student or a clergy, you could fly at a discount on a plane. And in the back of the Popular magazine, you could get a certificate sent to you. And I remember a lot of people getting certificates saying they were ministers so they could fly discount on the planes.
It still happens, but it's not so they can fly discount on the planes, it's so they task exams.
Yeah, I mean, you know,
they
they just
perform
open a
weddings, whatever.
storefront and say,
It's still the case. You can go tomorrow, and you can go today and get online, and you can be a minister by tonight. Online, and it's valid. It's legal under the U.S. government way of thinking. Right. And if form, basically, that's about it. Yeah.
When I do a lot of weddings, I'm amazed at how many. Actually, I spoke to a priest about this. He pulled up in front of the church, parked in front of the fire hydrant, put a sign in the windshield that said clergy, and walked into the church. Now, he wasn't doing anything except visiting the church. There was some ceremony going on. And I came out and I said, that's a clever sign. He said, I use it all the time. Nonchalant, he says it. He's simply better than MD on the license plate. He comes anywhere he wants.
I wish that were true. I certainly would use it too, but it doesn't always work, I can assure you.
But it's not just a sign. Anyone can print a sign and say clergy.
I got stopped one time by a police officer. I had my collar on, and he didn't even look in the car. And so I went to court to fight it, not because he didn't look in the car, but just because he claimed that he was, he had put on a siren, he was chasing after me, and he wanted to know why I didn't stop, and he didn't have a siren on. He was just flashing his lights. I thought, who's this idiot flashing their lights? I went down the street, and I went to court, and I was the last one there, and finally the judge said, Father, you here representing someone or seeing someone? I said, no, I'm the defendant. At that point, the district attorney hit the police officer over the head with the papers. It's just not. It's not a good thing, particularly to arrest the priest and give him a ticket. And but I had my chance in court, and I got to the officer got to testify, and he said, I had my. The guy wouldn't stop, and I said, Your Honor, I object. He said, you can't object. You have to make your turn, just wait. And he said, and the gentleman would not stop. And so anyway, I objected again, and I was told again I couldn't object. So finally I had my turn, and I said to the officer, I said, Officer, are you sure that you had your lights and siren on when you came after me? He says, well, that's standard procedure. I said, that's not what I asked you. I said, did you have your lights and siren on when you came after me? He says, I said that's standard procedure. I said, Your Honor. And he says, answer the Father's question. He says, well, I think so. I said, well, Your Honor, it seems to me if you can't remember whether or not he had his light and the siren on when he came after me, maybe you can't remember what color the light was when I went through it. And the judge hit this and said, case dismissed, answers to justice. You can, there are some perks to being clergy, but there are not many, let me tell you. And you don't get off any, no special discounts or anything anymore. The only discount we do get is that we do get discounts with regard to our property taxes, what we own, because the idea is that clergy usually don't own their own houses, which is true.
Getting back to your point about how do you know you're called, it brings up a spiritual working that I've been doing the last year, and that's the 5 steps of manifestation. And to become a priest or anything, like when I thought about it, become an optometrist, was, you know, you have to first be aware, you then have to choose, you have to do some sort of action, then I knew I was going to pull this. Yeah, I think I skipped one. But then it becomes manifestation. I'll think of the full point. But you know, each of the steps that you take, really, no matter priest or eye doctor or whatever, each one of them you're doing, and then it finally becomes. And then when, like you said before, you know, when somebody says, "Oh, you are the priest here," or you are, so each one. Especially that awareness part, I think, is really key.
But you know, the interesting thing about it is that no matter how much awareness you might have, the church doesn't really, as far as the church is concerned, they're not concerned about that. The final step is, I mean, that's not the final thing that, you can have all the awareness in the world, you may not be ordained. After all those things I told you that you went through seminary, you took your final exams and all that, and the bishop says, okay, even then you cannot be ordained unless the vestry of the church decides that you still are worthy. Because it has to come from your own community. And so, because you could have changed greatly from the time you started that process 7 years ago. Hopefully you've changed for the better. One of the things that always disturbed me about it was that many people get turned down to be clergy because they don't speak the language to begin with. It's really interesting. People think that they are called to be something, but they haven't learned the language yet particularly. And you might see in them the potential for them to learn the language to speak about it. But if you don't speak the right language when you go away for that Ministries Commission weekend, if you can't talk about your spiritual journey, or I think I've told you before, one of the first things they asked me, the first question I got asked when I went away from my discernment weekend was, defend your faith. I said, defend my faith. They all started scribbling, you know, he doesn't know what that means, you know. And you're trying to think, what do they want to hear out of this? How would you answer that question? And I had, you know, so a Nicene Creed came to mind, and I started reciting parts of that. And so people, oh, he knows that, that's good, you know. But if you didn't know the right language, you would never even get that far. Part of the problem, you would think that the whole idea of teaching you and you go to school is to learn that language. But many people never even get that far because they don't know what to begin with. So one of the things that is really important is how much the community has taught you and nurtured you along the way in order to have that language. People want to know that you already have a really strong foothold in it before they allow you to go on to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. You not only have to know part of the language or know it well, but you have to be able to talk well enough. And you have to be able to talk about what your spiritual journey is. You have to be able to talk about what your calling is. How do you know that you're called? How do you know that you're called? How do you know? It's just not a feeling. It could be that the people around you have confirmed it. They say, you know, I think you might be a good priest, or have you ever considered the priesthood, or things like that. That was certainly part of my background, because I was very involved in the church. But how do you know? How do you explain to other people the feeling that you have that says that you have been called to become a clergy person? Or for that matter, that you've been called to be anything. And one of the things that the church says is it's not enough for you to know. The people around you have to not only know also, but they have to be willing to put it down in writing and stake their reputations on what you think. Which is really very, very interesting.
You sound an awful lot like a Catholic.
It was a Roman Catholic thing.
This is exactly the kind of procedure you go through there.
Yeah.
I would think that over here, with no Pope, that you would be able to say, when you defend your faith, say, that's not my job, that's Elizabeth.
Yes. Well, she is the defender. That's what she's called. That's the title she's chosen for herself, or King Henry VIII chose it for her. But yeah, she is the defender of the faith. In that program I gave you from the.
That's where I got it.
Yeah. I went to an ordination, and then I went to an ordination on Wednesday night. A friend of ours who was ordained, and he was ordained in the Anglo-Catholic tradition, but an Anglo-Catholic tradition that is way, way, way foreign from any that I've ever seen. If you thought St. Albans Staten Island was interesting, I mean, this was like at one point, I looked around, I couldn't find him. He was prostrate on the ground. All of a sudden he dropped, and he was down, and he laid down on that ground for a long time while they read all those prayers. And Bishop Taylor was there. Luckily, Bishop Taylor, I had to hand it to him. He knew what to do. He got through the whole service, but there was so much incense. There were times at the altar I couldn't even see the people up there. And that's part of the thing. It's supposed to be the Holy of Holies, like you make it so it becomes ethereal that you can't tell. And I was thinking about how did he explain to them his ministerial process, because I had been on the Ministries Commission and I had seen or heard somebody who wanted to do this type of liturgy. I thought, well, he never would have gotten through. This is so foreign from almost anything I know. It just shows you how broad the Episcopal Church is. But one of the people that Ray said in the program they prayed for was Elizabeth, defender of the faith. And I think, was it you who asked me who Elizabeth was? Anthony said, who was Elizabeth? I said, Queen Elizabeth. Why were you praying for her? Well, because she's got an Anglican communion. She's the defender of the faith. And in very Anglo-Catholic circles, she's the lady. She's the man.
Did you choose the people that ordained you? In other words,
No, what's interesting about that was that at the ordination service, anybody ever here been to an ordination service? An ordination service at the Episcopal Church, everybody who is a priest, even if they're dressed like this or they're just sitting in the congregation, they come up and they lay hands on the person. So it's really very, very powerful. You could have 50 or 60 hands on you. And all those hands are hands that have been laid on by bishops, going all the way back to Peter. We claim that there's an unbroken chain all the way through. So it's very, very powerful to think that that's sort of thing that's going on all the time.
the laying on of hands that
That's
we
different.
used to say?
No. No. But it's the idea. The laying on hands in the creed?
Yeah, the old
Yes, the whole creed, yes, the whole idea that the laying on hands, that the chain's been unbroken all the way down. I'm sorry, yes it is. That's the same one we're talking about. Yeah. Well, I bring up this whole thing about calling because I think it's interesting for us to think, as we finish up today, what it is that we may be called to particularly, and how it is that we know, and how it is that the community supports that. One thing that the church wants to say for sure, the Episcopal Church wants to say for sure, is that no calling can be validated unless the community supports it. Unless the community supports it. And it calls on the community to constantly support it. Because you can have a calling and start to do what you're doing, but unless the community continually supports it, then there is no calling any longer. In the Baptist Church, for instance, if you want to be a minister, you just stand up one day and you announce to the congregation, say, I want to let you know, last night I had a vision, I had a dream, I had a feeling, and God has called me to this ministry. And if nobody in the congregation says amen, then you sit down and you never get up again. I'm serious. And it's the same sort of thing. The only way that Baptist ministers receive a call, and when they move to a different place, when the people in their parish stop supporting them, they move on to a different parish because they have a different call. It's that the people here they're no longer supporting the government on the lady. And then you have to move on because you no longer have a call to that place. You're not only called to ministry, but you're called to a specific place. And that's one of the things that I think is very, very interesting and important for us to examine and keep in mind, is that a calling only has its strength if the people continue to support it. Otherwise, the calling dies. The calling disappears. It has to be supported by the community.
I agree with that.
Huh?
I don't know that I agree with that.
Yeah, I don't know that people have to agree with it, but this is what the lessons the church says. Yeah. And some people would still feel that they're very, very called to something and go elsewhere, and they may be, but their calling may not be to that specific place. And the church wants to say that community is how it all gets actuated, how it all happens.
I'm sure it's happened, but I've never heard of a church dying off a parish and congregation because they lost the call. It's usually they lost money, or the building burned down, or something much more tangible. I've never heard because the priest left and the congregation couldn't care less, or something like that.
You weren't here 15 years ago.
I understand that those had very little people, but it still had some.
It had two.
It had some.
It had two attending, let's put it that way. There were other people who were erstwhile members. But basically, I think that the church at that point had lost, we can say, I think it had lost a lot of its direction. And even though we had money that was keeping the buildings open, the grounds open, the buildings and the grounds are not the church, it's the people. And I think that the church had lost a good part of its calling. And it was slated to be closed. Bishop Grind came here to close it and to merge it with Trinity downtown. Grace Stewart, who was the warden, one of the wardens at that time, she came and she padlocked the front door so he couldn't get in. She did.
Was he here to deconsecrate it?
He was here to close the parish. You don't deconsecrate a church unless it's actually sold. But he was here to close the parish, yes. That was it. He had had enough.
To close the doors.
To close the doors and say, no one else can come anymore. This is it. It's over. It's dead. How was it avoided? She blocked it out. He couldn't get in.
No, but after she did that, how did you overcome that?
I wasn't here then.
Well, this is before you came.
Before me, yeah.
Ah.
How did you overcome that?
How did what?
How did you overcome that? Once he came in and there was a lot of vicious letter writing going back and forth for a long time. I think that the archdeacon at that time stepped in and said, let's see if we can make something happen here. And it wasn't too long after that, a couple of years, I think 2 years after that, or 3 years after that, that I showed up on a part-time basis. But it was done through sheer tenacity, and you know, if you're going to close this church, it's over my dead body. So it was kept open.
I was going to say the very sad thing is that I've seen churches where the pastor or minister is awful, and they just can't get rid of it. They just can't get rid of them. So, you know, maybe what you're saying is that they're there with the support of the congregation, but you know, like I've seen churches where they started out like with 50 people, and they get down to 3 people. Those 3 people are going to keep that person there.
Well, the new pattern in the church now is to have what's called pastorates. My title is pastor. Other people have a title of rector. My title is pastor. And what that means, based upon our history here, is that if I should go, it's because 2 out of the 3 parties agreed that I should. The bishop, the vestry, and myself. So the bishop and the vestry think that I should go. I've already signed a contract saying I'm out of here. If the bishop and I say that I should stay, and the vestry says I should go, it doesn't make any difference. 2 out of 3.
So then your ministry is not being supported by the congregation.
No, it's not in that case. Although, but who would want to stay based upon that? I would, you know, and some people do. But by the same token, if the bishop thinks I should go, and I and the congregation say I'm staying, the bishop has no say about it. So it's, you know, it's a gamble that one takes in signing that type of arrangement. But the whole idea was to try to give a fair vision of the call.
Well, I'm just thinking about a different context where students that I come into contact with, they'll come to my office after being at Fordham for a while, and they'll say, I don't want to major in business like I came here because my parents wanted me to and they're paying the bill. And I always advise them, you have to do what you want. It's your life and you're paying the bill. But the point is, we often think that this calling comes from somewhere inside of us, right? But with the students, it's because they've been in a context, in a community at the university, and they realize that it's not business they want to do, it's something else that they found there. And so it's kind of similar to what you're saying about the calling, that it arises out of context. So you could say that it's natural or something, but it may seem natural and a sensibility that you have, but it's infused from being in the community.
Well, I'm going to end today by just leaving you with this, and we're going to talk more about it because the lessons for the next couple of weeks are all about callings. And that is that callings change as the community changes. And I can certainly say that my calling here has changed as the community has changed. And I think that's something to always keep in mind, is that, you know, just because you're called to something doesn't mean that's where you are forever. Although, as Ray was pointing out, my friend who was ordained the other day,